wave synchronization, and we begin to get patterns of the emergence of self-organization from noise. So you get total random noisy behavior with no God at the conscious level saying go in this direction, the rest, and suddenly we're beginning to get kind of patterns. So what we have is the very first discrimination is a form. So what I'm going to try to do is take Buddha's 5 skandhas and show you how the evolution of consciousness is precisely what is being described in Buddha's 5 skandhas, and that the actual 5 skandhas are an ontogeny, recapitulating phylogeny, a model for the evolution of consciousness. Buddha was sitting under the tree and stripped away consciousness and went down from consciousness to dispositional attitudes, to perceptions, to feelings, and to forms. And so I'm now going to go back in the other direction. So the very first thing we find here is a form of behavior, the lateral discrimination of no head, no tail, but just wildly beating. It gets directional motion, and a form of emergent behavior that wasn't there now begins to come forth. And so there is this quality of listening or stilling. So you have to put it in quotes because there's no mind in there yet, but there's a quality where it gets inhibited, and if one half gets inhibited and the other half is still beating, that's the form of new behavior of directional motion. So in beating like hell and going in another direction, it encounters the other. So here is this primordial kind of Hegelian problem of the self and the other, and the encounter with the other. In looking for, say, food and trying to suck onto something and the other trying to eat it, there's this kind of no conscious purpose, but just in that activity, if it goes so far and is stopped, and neither one is able to win the dialogue, then another emergent property begins to come forth, in which you get architectures, that things try to eat one another as food and then begin to find they're more interesting as architecture than as food. So they get stuck. This, of course, is the history of the mitochondria in our cells. So when many of them get stuck, these larger sluggish cell begins to find a new emergent property, that these wildly beating things that just out of noisy behavior begin to suddenly start moving in wave dynamical, coordinated, coherent behavior, that has now the quality of propelling the food particles in the glucose gradient along a train. So if you follow the swirl of all these corkscrew spirals, all the material is moving down at this end of the big protist critter, Mixotricha paradoxa, which is inside the termite's gut, and propels it down to its mouth where it can get at the food. And this protist inside a termite's gut breaks down the material into acetate, and so it can be digested. This little critter inside a termite is not an organ inside the termite. This is a totally independent individual animal, so that we're talking about symbiosis here. So you have the spirochete, and you have the protist, and then you have the protist inside the termite inside the forest inside the biosphere inside the galaxy, and it keeps on going. So when many of these properties begin to propel themselves, then again you find emergent properties that are coming without coordination, but begin to have aspects of patterning of self-organization. So now the interesting thing about it is that note that the wave dynamics are as important as the chemistry of whatever the inhibitors are doing. One spirochete beating next to another knocks the other into synchrony. So synchronized beating generates the emergent property of the corkscrew spiral that propels food to the mouth of the protist. Now this is Stuart Kaufman's point, one of the Lindisfarne Fellows. This is sort of wonderful Yenta and sort of the kind of maven of the Santa Fe Institute, is that order begins to emerge in the universe for free very early on, and that life isn't quite as freakish as we might have thought, and that there are principles of self-organization from noise that are as important as Darwinian selection. So part of the phenomenology of life that we're seeing here is not just selection and things trying to kill one another and then being selected out for survival, but a form of architecture of coordination where the principles of self-organization are as important to the description as just the surviving units themselves. So, of course, we have to ask ourselves, when we say principles, what are we talking about? This is the math and not the meat. Remember Maria Mulder's song, "It ain't the meat, it's the motion that makes your mama want to rock"? Anybody ever heard this song? It's a great song. Well, when you're looking at this stuff, you're seeing some of the wet stuff, which is the meat, but you're seeing all this incredible dance of life in the motion, and it ain't the meat, it's the motion that is really generating all these emergent properties and making the particular coordination where the food particles get swirled on down, and the animals move on farther down the old glucose trail. So we have to ask ourselves, what do we mean when we say principles? And so under a pinyon tree out in Lindisfarne, Colorado, I asked Stuart, I said, what are you talking about? Are these Platonic ideas? Is this Pythagoras all over again? When you say principles, what do you mean? Is this like a scientific law? And he said, I don't know. This is the big question that they're all working with in the sciences of complexity. But what is clear is that he's willing, and his whole book, which is impossible to understand. He's doing a book for the rest of us called At Home in the Universe, but his latest book, called The Origins of Order, is a real mind cruncher. And I asked another friend of mine, who's the chair of polymer chemistry in Zurich, and he said even he couldn't understand it. So at any rate, this is Stuart's life work, this huge 1,000-page thing on the origins of order and his theory of the origins of life. But the basic principle is that the dynamics of life and the emergence of life are coming from principles of self-organization, and that these life sort of surfs at the edge between chaos and order. And the two-ordered system is life-killing, and a absolutely random system isn't appropriate, but a chaotic system with kind of self-similarity and fractal complexity, those sciences are just perfect for the particular formation of me cells and membranes and closing cells and getting RNA and all the rest of it that's part of our story. But the important thing is it ain't the meat, it's the motion that is making this kind of great mother cell really rock. And what we're seeing between this wet stuff is when you look at all these close packing of all these vibrating critters, there are these larger moire patterns that appear. They almost look like ions in an electron microscope. They're all forms of kind of geometry, and the patterning may actually be enabling this emergent phenomenon to actually carry itself forth. It's almost like Plato's old distinction between the intelligible realm, which is the realm of mind and the angels, and then the sensible realm, the realm of the meat. And what you see in her video is precisely this kind of dance between Plato and Aristotle. Now, also when we see this little spirochete flagellating and this huge colossal protist, we can sort of recall the story of our own conception, where this little spermatozoa, which is the same protein, moving with this package on the end, has directional motion, and the slow, great, sluggish ovum rotates and tries to decide, of these hundreds of thousands of millions of little sperm cells saying, hey, mommy, look at me, hey, mommy, look at me, let me in. And somehow or other, the great mother in this rotation is listening to see which one in its vibrations or whatever has the particular kind of music that in the molecules inside is what she wants or is in harmony with what she's got. And she opens up and lets only one of the guys in and says, take me, boy, I'm yours, and in it goes, and we get conception. So that this little story of the spirochete and the protist is also the story of how we all got here. It's the story of conception. And so it's very much a kind of archetypal couple in the way that Rick Tarnas has described archetypal thinking in his book, The Passion of the Western Mind. So what you see in this music video is an archetypal music video, a construction of the dynamical, spunky little spirochete and the slow and sluggish, colossal great mother of the gigantic cell. But when you also look at and consider all the other architectures that occur with this kind of actin and tubulin proteins, you get the hair cells in the inner ear that are stuck into a neuron, and they vibrate, and they're in rows, and they vibrate when a physical wave of music comes and strikes them, and they turn that physical wave back into an electrical signal in the big, colossal, great mother cell of the neuron and send it on down in. Also, there's some sense that the actin structure of the nerve, I believe a biologist told me, is analogous also to the clitoris. So that the whole notion of Rudolf Steiner, Robert saying that in the future sexuality would be from the throat chakra and would be vibration, there's a kind of interesting recapitulation that if you go back to the whole notion of vibration and music and sexuality and orality and the ear and the rest of it, that there are these homologous functions that are kind of cute and vibratingly exciting. So this is the kind of music, it ain't the meat, it's the motion that makes your mama want to rock. So that every time you live, that's like a koan. The more you think of Maria Madot's song, the more it just vibrates over and over and over again with all kinds of different meaning. So think about spermatozoa, think of neurons and axons, but also think of the mitotic spindle inside the nucleus, that when these guys split, and they transport the genes and the DNA, there are also these little vibrating things that are the transport freight trains for the whole quality of the cellular mitosis. So in all these various kinds of architectures, there's a similar pattern that's going on that's recapitulating the basic story of the little spirochete, the dynamical, spunky little male, and this slow, colossal, whether it's a neuron or an ovum. So in the first quality, we have the first skanda of a form, but when you move up the channel, and you get now, say, the next stage up when you get two channels coming in, not just a lateral discrimination where one is inhibited and the other is uninhibited and is moving, but you get, say, a reactivity to light and a reactivity to darkness and a reactivity to, say, the glucose gradient, that there's more acid or base or more glucose in this direction. When you cross two channels and you get now, say, darkness, as in a cyanobacteria, and you get glucose or acid and base in a pH scale, the two of them crossing give you now an interpretive domain, or the next skanda in Buddha, a feeling. So when, say for example, you're a little cell and you have a situation where it's dark and acid, and when they come together it means danger. And when it's light and it's base, it means safe, it's food, eat. Here's a primordial archetypal situation of eat or be eaten, fight or flight. But when you cross these two dimensions, then suddenly it's no longer a form, it's a feeling. It's now an interpretive domain, danger, be eaten, or it's okay, it's food, it's safe, you can eat. And an interpretive domain is the next ontological level up and gives us the kind of dual complex of the second skanda in Buddha. But what you need are two dimensions, two channels that cross, and when they cross, you get an interpretive domain of a sense of feeling. And of course, Maturana and Varela, years ago in their book Autopoiesis and Cognition, The Realization of the Living, wanted to take cognition down to the level of the cell. And that was very radical in the early 70s. But now the more that's coming in, the more that really seems the way to go with it. And so especially as we get into psychoneuroimmunology, or we get into Mira Richard's mysticism of the cells and death and the rest of it. Now notice the important thing here is that two channels give us an interpretive domain or a feeling, but they may come in at different times. So let's say the first channel comes in and says it's dark, but you're waiting to, get this other register. Yeah, but what's the pH scale? Is it acid or base, or is, what's the glucose gradient? Is it more glucose here or more glucose at my rear end? Which way do I zag? If those two come in at different times, then there's a need to sort of have lingering molecular memory, like telephone memory, where the dark sensation will linger just long enough so it's molecularly accessible to the glucose gradient to get the two to link. And when they link, then you have the interpretive domain. So now the quality of the temporal ensemble is getting really extremely important. Now if you add a third channel to the dimension, this is where I think you get a perception. So if you've got three different forms coming in of orientation, glucose gradient, light, dark, and they're all coming in at different times, the temporal difference between those three channels is creating an extensive field that has to be stabilized to give you something new that's now called a perception. It's not just a feeling like danger, it's a coordinated temporal ensemble that gives you the third skanda of Buddha, or perception. So what this temporal ensemble is really the beginnings, the extensive field, the beginnings of egohood, because a perception is much more of a coordinated self-referential event horizon or experience than just simply a reactivity. So that the whole quality of time begins to be very important. Now Varela has described in his work that's going on in the Institute for Neurosciences in Paris that our whole sense of now can be measured neurologically, that it's between a fifth and a quarter of a second. Anything longer than that tends to become part of the next experience of now and gets deferred to become the next moment. Anything shorter than that begins to be not perceivable to consciousness. So it begins to be what Gregory Bateson in Steps to an Ecology of Mind calls a process of consciousness, but not a product of consciousness. It's what runs the television set, but it isn't actually the image that's registering on the television set. So it's part of the sort of neural wiring, to use the traditional cognitivist metaphor that Varela doesn't like for good reasons. So the important quality of this is that temporal difference, all these signals coming in slightly discoordinated, means that somehow or other an extensive delay space has to